Today I'm going to give you guys the weed management update, which basically covers mostly herbicide resistant weeds and how to manage them properly. This is a presentation that generally is presented by either me or Dr. Bill Johnson at Purdue. But before I get into the topics of the presentation for today, the first thing I want to do is just point out some of the resources that we have available for you at Purdue. The first one is the Purdue Weed Science website. This is a great resource because we post several articles regarding weed management in corn, soybeans, how to use cover crops as well for weed suppression, as well as some articles on cereals such as wheat as well. We also post some of our research data in this website. So if you want to look some of the products that we've been testing and how well they work in this particular weed species, you can find that data in the website as well. If you use social media, we also have a Facebook page, and that is a great resource where you can find information about new technologies coming to the market, new soybean traits, new herbicides, and new regulation regarding those herbicides as well. So if you use social media, that's a great avenue to get information quickly. With all the restrictions of meeting in person that this year has brought, we also have boosted up our YouTube channel as well. So we have several different videos with current topics in weed science that you can find in our YouTube channel as well. But you can also contact us by using our email address or phone number at any time during the growing season if you have any questions regarding weed management. We use Twitter as well. So if you follow us on Twitter, you can get timely information on weed management. Another great resource that we have is the Weed Control Guide, which is a publication that we put together with the University of Illinois and Ohio State University. And the great thing about this publication is that you can have efficacy tables for several different herbicides on different weed species. So if you're trying to design a herbicide program that's going to work the best for your field, for the weeds that you have in your field, this is a great resource, and I would recommend you guys get a copy of it if you don't have it yet. And finally, we also have the Take Action Initiative, which is a collaboration between the universities and the private industry, where they put a lot of resources on how to manage herbicide resistance, how to prevent it, and how to get rid of it once you have herbicide-resistant weeds in your field as well. So if you go to this website, there's a lot of free resources that you can find. So the outline of my presentation today, mainly I want to talk about the management of major herbicide-resistant weeds that we have here in the state of Indiana. I'm also going to talk about how we can use cover crops as an additional tool to manage those herbicide-resistant weeds. And then I'm going to give you a quick summary about herbicide drift in Indiana, what's the situation, and what happened to Dicamba this year, and some of the label changes that we're going to have for the future as well. And at the end, depending on how much time we have, I'm going to talk about some of the 2020 weed control challenges that we had, some of the lessons that we can learn from it, and how we prevent that from the future to happen in the future as well. So the reason I'm here today, the reason I got this job is because herbicide resistance is such a major issue in Indiana, not only in Indiana, but the entire Midwest. And this table here kind of summarizes the current state of herbicide resistance in Indiana. So as you can see, we have a few weeds here that have developed resistance to the PS2 inhibitor herbicides or group 5. Those are herbicides like atrazine. So if you use atrazine and you have a resistant population, you might not get good suppression of these weed species. And we also have quite a bit of different weed species that have developed resistance to the ALS inhibitor herbicides, which are herbicides in the group 2. Some of the commercial trade names are herbicides such as Classic, Pursue, First Rate, and Canopy as well. So as you can see, we have quite a few different weeds that have developed resistance to this herbicide already. And of course, we have the glyphosate resistant weeds. We have 5 glyphosate resistant weeds in Indiana, including common and giant ragweed, Maristail, and tall Waterhemp and Palmer Amaranth. Those are kind of our most problematic weeds because we rely on glyphosate so much for weed management in corn and soybeans. But of course, our most important issue are those weeds that have developed resistance not only to glyphosate, but also to the ALS herbicides and the PPO inhibitor herbicides as well. Those are the populations that we call multiple resistant weeds. If you have populations with multiple resistance, glyphosate resistant soybeans are not going to be a good choice for you anymore, and you probably have to migrate to some different soybean trait like Liberty soybeans or Extend or Enlist soybeans, or you have some different options for post-emergence control of those weeds. So why is herbicide resistant? Why does herbicide resistant happens, and how we can prevent it? Well, basically, we already have herbicide resistant weeds that exist in the wild populations at very low levels. So they're already out there. We're just selecting for those herbicide resistant weeds every time that we apply a certain herbicide. So if we keep applying the same herbicide repeatedly, slowly but surely, we increase the frequency of resistance of those individuals in a population. And by the time we notice that we have resistant weeds, it's kind of too late to go back most times to get rid of those resistant weeds. So if no other weed control measure is taken, if we don't remove those weeds at the end of the growing season, we're going to end up with more resistant plants, and the frequency is going to increase in the long term. So we want to use an integrated weed management approach to help reduce the spread of those herbicide resistant weeds, not solely relying on a single herbicide multiple times a year. So Sarah told me that one of our main concerns in your area is the pigweed species, especially the controlled waterhemp. We have two very problematic pigweed species in Indiana. Waterhemp tends to be more of a problem in wet years. It likes wet weather for germination. And we also have Palmer Amaranth, which can be more problematic if you have dry years. It likes more dry weather for germination. You can actually kill Palmer Amaranth if you have flooded conditions as well. This map here is just kind of to illustrate the status of herbicide-resistant waterhemp in Indiana. The map here on the left shows glyphosate-resistant populations, all the counties that we have confirmed for glyphosate resistance, and the map on the right shows PPO resistance, which will be resistance to herbicides such as Cobra and Flexstar and Blazer as well. One thing that I'd like to point out about these maps is that this is likely an underestimation of the issue because we only confirm a resistance on those counties where we got a sample from the county with a concern about herbicide resistance. If we don't get a sample, we're not able to test for those mutations, and we're not able to confirm herbicide resistance in other areas. So these maps here are definitely an underrepresentation of the spread of herbicide-resistant waterhemp in Indiana. So what can we do to control waterhemp? And this again is assuming that we have glyphosate and ALS resistance, which is pretty widespread in Indiana at this point, but we still don't have a resistance to the PPO herbicides such as Cobra and Flexstar. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to start clean at planting and use residuals during that planting as well. Some of the most effective residuals for waterhemp suppression are residual herbicides such as Authority, Valor, and Zidua. Those will be my first pick in terms of effectiveness. But if you're using at least 6 ounces of metribuzin or dual product or a warrant, you can still get some good suppression of those waterhemp as well. So you start it clean and you use the residuals at the time of planting. You also want to be timely about your post-emergence application, and also add another layer of residual herbicides to that post-emergence application. And I'm going to explain a little bit why we make that recommendation. But basically, waterhemp and Palmer Amaranth can germinate pretty much throughout the entire growing season, all the way up to late August, sometimes even September. So if you don't add a residual with your post-emergence application, you can still have plants germinating late in the season and producing seeds. So what are your options for managing waterhemp post-emergence? It really depends on the soybean trait that you're growing. And for non-GMO soybeans, you can still spray Flexstar, Cobra, or Blazer. This again is assuming that you do not have PPO resistance. If you do, none of those options will be effective. If you're growing Liberty soybeans, you can spray products such as Liberty or any other glyphosate product. And if you're growing Extend soybeans, you can use a Dicamba product such as Extending Max, Ingenia, or Tavian. We also have Enlist soybeans in the market. For those, you can spray products such as 2,4-D or Liberty or a combination of the two. I would say the combination of the two would probably be the most effective option for Waterhemp control post-emergence. And for the 2021 growing season, we also have the Extend Flex soybeans, which are allow for applications of either Dicamba or Liberty products. So if you're trying to avoid applications of Dicamba, you have a little more flexibility. You can use a Liberty product as your post-emergence herbicide while still having tolerance to Dicamba drift if that happens in your area. So why do we recommend using a residual herbicide with your post-emergence application? This is kind of a diagram that kind of explains why we make that recommendation. Basically, this red triangle here is an application of a residual herbicide. We start with a high rate of the residual herbicide, and it starts to, the concentration of that residual herbicide, it starts to decrease over time. This little star right here represents a post-emergence application, and this green wave right here represents when the crop is canopy. So in a traditional soybean program, what we usually do, we put a residual at planting, and then we do a post-emergence application with no residual in that application. And there is a window of time there where we don't have crop canopy yet, and new Waterhemp flush can happen. We can have new germination to occur. If we use a layer residual approach and we add another residual herbicide with that post-application, we actually cover that window of germination, and we can protect the field until we actually achieve crop canopy. And the main reason we make that recommendation is because Palmer Amaranth and Waterhemp, again, they can germinate throughout the entire growing season. And even small plants that germinate late, they can still produce a few 100,000 seeds. So you want to make sure you control them. You want to manage the soil seed bank. You don't want to let those weeds go to seed, because they're gonna, if they increase the soil seed bank, your herbicide program is going to become more expensive year to year. So if you have PPO resistance, the only difference in our recommendation is that you should not grow non-GMO soybeans, because you're not going to have any options for post-emergence control of Waterhemp in non-GMO soybeans. You can still use PPO products such as Authority and Valor as a residual. Even though they're PPO herbicides, they're still going to have activity as a residual on Waterhemp emergence as well. So we would still recommend using those products as a residual at planting. For Palmer Amaranth, the recommendation is the same. The herbicides that are going to be effective for Waterhemp are also going to be effective for Palmer. The only thing you have to know is what's your status of resistance. Do you have glyphosate resistance, ALS resistance, or also PPO resistance as well? So you got to know your resistance status to pick the best herbicide program for your field. So what else can we do other than herbicides? Like I mentioned earlier, every time we spray a herbicide, we're selecting for herbicide resistance. So we got to do something else. We got to use an integrated weed management approach. And the main purpose of the integrated weed management approach is to manage the soil seed bank. You got to make sure that eventually over time you're depleting Waterhemp seed from the weed seed bank in the soil. So some of the options that you have to achieve that is to use tillage to control emerge plants, make sure those plants don't go to seed. And if you have a field that is heavily infested with Waterhemp or Palmer, one option that you can do is use dip tillage, and in those worst case scenarios. So you want to bury all that seed deep into the soil, and then you don't want to use tillage for a while. You want to keep that seed buried deep so it doesn't come back, it doesn't germinate, and you can kind of reduce the seed bank with a single practice. Cover crops are also an option to consider, and they've shown a lot of promise in the southern United States, especially in states like Arkansas, Mississippi, and the South. But here in Indiana, we kind of have a more unpredictable weather. So the results are kind of a mixed bag. Some years we get good suppression cover crops. Some years we don't produce as much biomass with those cover crops, and we don't get as much weed suppression. In Indiana, our best results are with cereal rye. This is one of the best, most suppressive cover crops that we tested. Annual rye has not worked well for Palmer amaranth and Waterhemp here in Indiana, so I wouldn't pick annual rye if you're looking to weed suppression, if that's one of your goals in growing that cover crop. Hand weeding, this is a common practice in the South where they have bigger problems with herbicide resistance. We are not in this situation still in Indiana, but we gotta be willing to pull out a few scapes at the end of the growing season. And the reason for that is, again, Waterhemp and Palmer can produce a few hundred seeds in a single plant. So if you're pulling out a few plants, getting rid of those before they put out seed, you're gonna reduce the soil seed bank, and that's gonna make your life easier in the following years. We also gotta keep in mind, and we gotta control those weeds, those pigweed plants in the field edges and the drainage ditches, because a lot of times that's how they get introduced into new areas of the field. They just keep growing on the edges of the field until eventually they make their way into the field. And also another thing to keep in mind is that the combines are great spreaders of those pigweed plants. So we wanna make sure to harvest those heavily infested fields last. And after we're done harvesting those infested fields, we wanna take the combine back to the shop, make sure we clean it very well. And if you can afford it, maybe set it on fire, get rid of it. But if you cannot afford it, you gotta make sure you clean those combines very well. Otherwise, you can introduce those noxious weeds into different fields. And this picture here is kind of just to illustrate how easy those weeds can spread around new areas. This is a picture from a farmer here in Indiana that bought some hay from Kansas. And a few weeks later, he went into his field and he saw that there was this weird looking plant growing there. This is actually Palmer amaranth. And in weed science, we know that Kansas is notorious for having all sorts of issues with herbicide resistant Palmer amaranth. So if you want to get Palmer amaranth from anywhere, the last place you want to get it from would be Kansas. So this farmer got a pretty huge problem in his hand by having contaminated products. In this picture here is also, this is actually in Lafayette, Indiana. There's actually a Waterhemp plant here growing on top of this house. And this is actually a call to some of the research that the University of Missouri has conducted. They were able to show that migratory birds can ingest Waterhemp and Palmer amaranth seeds, and those seeds are still viable after digestion. So migratory birds are also another source for the spread of herbicide-resistant weeds, such as Waterhemp and Palmer amaranth. And here is also another Waterhemp plant just growing by the side of the road, probably fell off a truck or a tractor or something driving by. So those weeds don't need a lot of soil or water to actually thrive. Another weed that's very prominent in Indiana and a major issue is horseweed, which is also known as Maristail. Horseweed or Maristail can behave as either a winter annual or a summer annual weed, which means it can germinate either in the fall or in the spring. If we have fall emerged Maristail, we might want to consider a fall application, because if you only do a fall burn, spring burn now, those weeds might be a little too big by the time we do our spring burn now, and the herbicides are not going to be effective if we're spraying very large plants. So our recommendation for managing Maristail is that we want to be free of Maristail at the time of planting, again, just like Waterhemp and Palmer, because Maristail is very tough to control after the crop's out of the ground. Our options for herbicides are more limited as well. So how do we go about getting free of Maristail at the time of planting? We can use tillage if you're a conventional till. Tillage is very effective on Maristail, especially because it's such a small seeded broadleaf. If you bury that seed, it's not going to germinate. Or if you're a no-till farmer, you should use an aggressive burnout approach. And what do I mean by an aggressive burnout approach? You want to plan on a 2-pass burnout program, either a fall application followed by a spring application. And that is the case if you have fall germinated Maristail, or two applications in the spring as well, if the weather allows. We know that the weather in the spring does not always allow for 2 applications, but if you're able to, that's our recommendation. Another thing to keep in mind is that you should not rely on glyphosate by itself or 2,4-D alone. Those products are not going to be effective by themselves in a burnout application, especially glyphosate because of resistance. Also, some other synthetic auxins like Dicamba and Elevore are going to be slightly better than 2,4-D as a herbicide option for a burnout application. But regardless of which one of these you pick, you should always keep in mind that you should not spray large plants. If those plants are larger than 8 inches, it's going to be very difficult to control them regardless of your herbicide choice. So we started free of Maristail at the time of planting. You also want to use a full rate of soil residual herbicides. And our recommendation is that you apply these residual herbicides in the spring. They're going to be more effective. You're going to get more benefit out of your application. If you use a residual herbicide in the fall, it's probably just going to wash out by the time the spring comes around. So you're not going to get the best result out of a fall application for residuals for Maristail. And some of the residual herbicides that you can use for Maristail suppression are herbicides such as metribuzin. You want to make sure you use at least 5 ounces, or products such as Valor and Authority as well will provide suppression of Maristail emergence. So what can we do post-emergence for Maristail? We're assuming that we have glyphosate and ALS resistance. Again, that's commonplace in Indiana at this point. Most populations already develop resistance to those 2 classes of herbicides. One of our options is to grow corn. We have several different herbicides that can be effective for Maristail control in corn. Or we have to transition to a different soybean trait that allows us for applications of effective herbicides post. In Liberlink soybeans, we can use glufosinate products. In Extend soybeans, we can use Dicamba products. Or in Extend Flex soybeans, which is going to be available this next growing season, we can use either a Dicamba product or also glufosinate. And for Enlist soybeans, we can use either 2,4-D or glufosinate, or a combination of 2,4-D and glufosinate as well. So next weed I want to talk about is giant ragweed. Giant ragweed is a highly competitive weed that we have here in the state of Indiana. If it's left uncontrolled, we can get as much as 90% yield reduction if you even are able to actually harvest your crop. Because if you have a heavy infestation, you might not be able to even drive the combine through the field. This weed is also an alternate host for stem-boring insects. And why is this relevant? Is because those injured plants are also harder to control. If those plants are damaged by those insects, the herbicides are not going to translocate very well throughout the plant. You're not going to get good activity, and that might reduce your effectiveness. Also, one thing about giant ragweed is that it can emerge from early April all the way to August, and it can germinate up to 5 inches deep into the soil. So we can have a giant ragweed coming up all throughout the season and from very deep in the soil. And that's one of the reasons why the soil residual herbicides are not that effective on giant ragweed. Because if you spray a soil residual herbicide and you don't get a lot of rainfall, you're not going to get the herbicide deep enough into the soil to get good activation and suppress giant ragweed emergence. And we also have documented resistance in giant ragweed to both the ALS herbicides and glyphosate as well. This map here is just to show you the distribution of herbicide-resistant giant ragweed here in Indiana. The map on the left is glyphosate resistance. This is data from a survey in 2008 and 2014. We haven't had a survey since then. So again, this is probably an underestimation of the problem. And this is the distribution for ALS resistant giant ragweed. Again, ALS herbicides are herbicides such as Canopy, Classic, Pursue, and First Rate. Again, we only test ALS for ALS resistance for samples that have been submitted to our diagnostic lab. If we don't get a sample, we're not able to confirm herbicide resistance. So again, this might be an underestimation of the issue as well. So what can we do to manage giant ragweed? Again, if you're a conventional till, You can use tillage close to the time of planting. If you're no-till, some of the herbicide burn-down programs that work are glyphosate plus 2,4-D, or glyphosate plus dicamba, or sharpen plus glyphosate is another effective option. Or you can also use gramoxone plus metribuzin plus 2,4-D. And if you know that you still have ALS susceptible populations, you can still use some herbicides such as Canopy, First Rate, Valor XLT, and others. Those are going to provide some suppression of those giant ragweed emerging plants throughout the season. Again, it all depends on activation of those herbicides with the rain. And what can we do post-emergence? Again, it all depends on your soybean trait. We're assuming that you have ALS and glyphosate resistance, kind of the worst case scenario for giant ragweed. Even if you have ALS and glyphosate resistance, you can still grow non-GMO soybeans, and herbicides such as Flexer followed by Cobra would be effective on giant ragweed. But again, you've got to make sure you optimize your application technology to get good activity out of those herbicides. If you grow LiberLink soybeans, we recommend 2 passes of glufosinate. For Extend soybeans, you can use a dicamba product. And for Enlist soybeans, you can use 2,4-D or Liberty or a combination of the two. And I forgot to mention here, but we also have Extend Flex soybeans where you can use either a dicamba product or glufosinate as well. But regardless of which one of those soybean traits you plant and which herbicide you're going to use post-emergence, one thing to keep in mind is that the timing of that post-application is critical. Giant ragweed is one of those weeds that grows very rapidly. So it's very easy to miss your application window. And especially for contact herbicides like Flexer, Cobra, or Liberty, those are not going to be effective on large plants. So you want to make sure you spray them when they're small. And again, you also want to scout those fields for late emerging plants and scapes. This weed can germinate all the way up to August. So if you don't get crop canopy by then, you can still have those plants germinating. Now I'm gonna want to switch gears and talk about cover crops and weed control. So I don't know if you want to maybe take a pause and take any questions now, or I can just keep going and take the questions at the end. Well, I guess I'll just keep going then. So cover crops is one of those tools that we can use in an integrated weed management approach to take some of the pressure off of the herbicides and reduce the selection for herbicide resistance. But one thing to keep in mind is that cover crops, they may suppress the emergence of winter annual weeds and some early emerging summer annuals. They're not going to be effective on all different weeds. And they can serve as an additional tool for weed management, but they will not replace the use of herbicides, especially for those tough to control weeds. And I'm going to show you guys a few photos of this in a little bit. Again, there's some people out there that are saying, oh, if you grow a certain cover crop, you don't need to spray a herbicide. That's not always the case. It all depends on your weed pressure and what weed species you have in your field. So again, one of the first bullet points that I mentioned, the cover crops can help suppress winter annual weeds. Here we have a cereal rye that was terminated at planting. We had about 5,500 pounds of biomass to the acre. So we had a lot of biomass, and that was able to suppress some of the winter annual weeds. Here we can see some chickweed where we didn't have cover crop, and we see that all this chickweed was suppressed by the use of cereal rye. We also have no suppression observed for cereal rye that was terminated 2 weeks early. Again, it all depends on the amount of biomass that you can accumulate. If you have more cover crop biomass, you can have better suppression of those weeds. However, another concern with terminating those cover crops later for higher biomass is that we can have some interference of the cover crop with your cash crop. So terminating your cover crop late might result in yield losses in some situations. So here's just a few pictures to illustrate how cover crops can help suppress some of the summer and winter annual weeds. Here we have a picture of giant ragweed. We can see a cereal rye, a living stand of cereal rye here. Very few giant ragweeds. Still we have a few in there, but way less than here in a bare ground situation. Same with horseweed. Cereal rye is very consistent at suppressing horseweed, so it's probably one of the best. Is one of the best uses of cereal rye is to suppress Maristail problems. And we also with Waterhemp as well. We can see we reduce the size and the number of Waterhemp plants by using cereal rye as a cover crop. But again, results will vary year by year. It all depends on how much biomass we can accumulate going into the growing season. And here's just a few more pictures of using cereal rye to suppress Maristail. Again, by using cereal rye, we're able to reduce not only the size of those Maristail plants, but also the density, as you can see in the picture here on the left. So by reducing the size and the density of those Maristail plants, we actually extending our application window for a herbicide application. These plants here on the right will still be on the label for a herbicide application. The plants here on the left wouldn't be on the label anymore for a herbicide application. We can see the same with giant ragweed here. We can see early season suppression with cereal rye used for corn. We can see that we still have quite a bit of plants here in the middle of the corn row, but those plants are smaller and they're probably easier to, they'll be easier to kill with a herbicide application. And they will also cause less interference with the crop and less competition. Same situation here. Cereal rye will reduce early season giant ragweed growth rates. These are giant ragweed plants that are grown in glyphosate terminated cereal rye, and this is grown after a fallow glyphosate burnout. So we can see just by using a cover crop and terminating at planting, we can reduce the size and density of those weeds. It also works for grassy weeds. This is a fallow plot with no cover crop. We have a lot of giant foxtail and barnyard grass that came up. And by using a cover crop, we're able to suppress most of that grass emergence early in the season. We'll still have some giant ragweed that pop through that cover crop. But again, the size and the density of those plants is much lower than without it. All right, so kind of the summary here for cover crops and weed control. We want to keep in mind that cover crops reduce the density and the size of the weeds. When with that, we can reduce the selection pressure for herbicide resistance, and it can also provide a wider window for application of herbicides by reducing the weed size. And again, the cover crops may serve as an additional tool for weed management, but they do not replace the use of herbicides. We gotta use cover crops as a combined strategy with herbicides, not just exclude the use of herbicides by having a cover crop. Now I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about herbicide drift in Indiana, kind of what happened in the past few years, well, especially with Dicamba. Herbicide drift has always been an issue in the state of Indiana since we started using herbicides in the 50s. And most of the time it happens early in the growing season. Some of the repeat offenders, as I like to call, are herbicides such as Sharpen, 2,4-D, Dicamba, and Glyphosate. And the reason those herbicides drift early in the growing season is because those are the herbicides we use for a burnout application, and usually it's windy during burnout applications. But before the introduction of Xtend soybeans, we only had about 100 complaints a year. After the introduction of Xtend soybeans, in the first year we had a total of 233 total complaints for drift in Indiana, and over half of those complaints were related to Dicamba. Same trend in 2018, and in 2019 we actually broke our record for drift concerns in Indiana. We had 275 total complaints, and over 70% of those complaints were related to Dicamba drift. So we had a few changes for the 2020 growing season. We had a June 20th cutoff date for the state of Indiana. And also on June 3rd, we had a decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals that vacated the registration of some of those Dicamba products, including Extendemax, Ingenia, and Fexapen. But for a while here, those products had their registration canceled, and we were not sure if we were going to be able to use those herbicides in the 2021 growing season. But if any of you guys are growing Xtend soybeans and you talk to your pesticide dealer, you probably already know that the Dicamba products got a new registration, and that is a 5-year registration from 2021 to 2025. There's a few changes, though, to that label to address some of those drift concerns with Dicamba. And the first change I'd like to point out is that they increased the downwind buffer to 240 feet. That's what is required now. It used to be 110. And if you are in a county where you have endangered species, the downwind buffer is actually 310 feet. But there is opportunities for growers to use hooded sprayers to reduce those buffers back to what it used to be, so 110 downwind or 240 if you have endangered species. There's only a couple of companies now that produce those hooded sprayers. They're approved by the EPA. I believe one of those companies is called Red Ball. So you might look into it if you want to make that investment and reduce the size of the buffer for using Dicamba. There's also a nationwide cutoff date for Dicamba application on soybeans, which is June 30th. That's what kind of the national label, the federal label says. We don't know yet how the Office of Indiana State Chemist might want to change that cutoff date for the state of Indiana. And then this new label is also requiring the use of a pH buffering agent to be tank mixed with the Dicamba product to lower volatility. So let's say you're spraying Extendemax, which already has vapor grip. You can actually purchase some additional vapor grip as a separate adjuvant to add into that tank as a buffering agent. And I know BASF is also coming up with their product as well to be used as a buffering agent for Ingenia. Another change as well is that the states can expand the over-the-top use to meet the local needs by working with the EPA. So they can expand that use, but actually the EPA is not allowing the state agencies to actually use the 24C section of the label to restrict what the federal label says. So last year, the Office of Indiana State Chemist used the 24C section of the label to establish the June 20th cutoff date. They cannot use that section of the label anymore. If they want to establish a different cutoff date from the federal label, they would have to use the 24A, which is a more complicated, more bureaucratic pathway, and will take more paperwork to get it done. So we'll see what will happen in the future. The Office of Indiana State Chemist is actually still evaluating this new federal label to see how Indiana is going to position itself regarding Dicamba applications. They have a website, which is a great resource for Dicamba updates. If you have any questions about the current state of Dicamba, for now, they kind of still processing that decision from the federal label and see how this new registration is going to be applied in Indiana. Another relevant news in the world of weed science is that, again, like I mentioned earlier, the Xtend Flex soybeans got their approval, so they can be commercialized and planted in the 2021 growing season. The difference between Xtend Flex and Xtend soybeans is that Xtend Flex allow for both Dicamba, glyphosate, and also the glufosinate to be applied post-emergence. So let's say you want to avoid spraying Dicamba because of the volatility or drift concerns, you could switch to a glufosinate product such as Liberty as a post-emergence herbicide to get rid of some of those herbicide-resistant weeds. We also have Enlist in the market. The Enlist also has their own application restrictions. We have to go to the website to see all those restrictions in detail. But basically, there's a much more flexible buffer. It's only about 30 feet to a sensitive area. But just like the Xtend products, you cannot spray if wind is blowing towards a susceptible crop. So keep that in mind. There's no cutoff date. There's a cutoff growth stage, which is R2 soybeans or full flowering. So that's what the only thing you gotta look into to do that post-emergence application. You gotta also look for a herbicide, approved herbicide tank mixes and nozzles. One of the advantages of using a list is that you can mix with an ammonium sulfate, which is not the case for dicamba products. In dicamba products, you increase volatility by adding ammonium sulfate. The wind limits are from 3 to 15 miles per hour, and the label recommends 10 to 15 gallons per acre GPA and a boom height of 24 inches above the target. So considering that we're gonna have both enlist and extend soybeans in the market for the foreseeable future, and we're gonna have both dicamba and 2,4-D drift happening, we can expect that. It is important not only for farmers, but also CCAs and pesticide applicators to be able to differentiate between 2,4-D and dicamba injury on soybeans. So for that reason, last year we put a publication together looking into how to differentiate 2,4-D and dicamba on soybeans. If you want to look into that publication, it's available for free at this link. You can also just Google the title and you can find that publication as well. So I'm gonna go over some of the highlights for this publication. So what are the main differences for 2,4-D and dicamba drift in soybeans? So for 2,4-D, most of the time you're only gonna see leaf strapping, stem twisting, and callus formation. And for dicamba, most of the time you're only gonna see leaf cupping. For dicamba injury, one thing to keep in mind is that it takes very little dicamba to cause soybean injury. We can have injury at less than 0.2% of the field rate. I'm considering the field rate to be 22 ounces per acre of XtendiMax. One thing about dicamba too is that the symptoms are slower to develop, but they might persist for several weeks. So it might take a couple weeks for you to see symptoms of dicamba exposure, but once you actually see symptoms, they might persist for the entire growing season, depending on weather conditions. For 2,4-D, those plants will show injury within a few hours of exposure. Mostly you can see leaf droop, but most of the time they'll grow out of it, especially if it's only a drift concern. That might not be the case if you have tank contamination. And the yield losses for 2,4-D are only gonna occur if you have about 5% of the field rate. So again, soybeans are much less sensitive to 2,4-D than they are to dicamba. But one thing to keep in mind is that for either 2,4-D and dicamba, those yield losses vary depending on the growth stage at the time of herbicide exposure and also the environmental conditions following that exposure. So if you get hit early in the growing season, but then you have good weather condition afterwards, it's unlikely that you're gonna see yield reductions. However, if you get hit somewhere in the middle of the season and the conditions are dry, you don't have enough moisture, you are more likely to see yield impacts. Also in the reproductive growth stage, that's a very sensitive stage for dicamba drift. So what are the 2,4-D symptoms? Mostly you can see callus formation on the stems, like you can see in this picture here. You can also see leaf strapping and stem twisting. You can also see leaf strapping for dicamba sometimes, but most of the times the leaves are gonna be cupped instead of strapped. And you're rarely gonna see stem twisting for dicamba. Most of the time, if you see stem twisting, it's 2,4-D or another auxin herbicide. It takes a significant rate of dicamba to actually cause a stem twisting. So for dicamba, we can see most of the time leaf cupping. That's what the general symptom is. But sometimes if you have a tank contamination issue, we actually might see Maristem death. So the growing point of those soybeans might die, especially if you have a tank contamination situation. So now kind of changing topics, I want to talk about some of the weed control challenges that we face in the 2020 growing season. The first one will be herbicide carryover. That was a big one this year, especially with herbicides such as Callisto. I had about 20 different samples of Callisto carryover this growing season, but we can also have carryover atrazine herbicides, also herbicides such as Flexer, or some of the ALS herbicides such as Classic, Pursue, and First Rate. So the herbicide carryover is influenced by several factors, including soil properties, rainfall, and herbicide application timing. So if you have a soil that is sandy and low in pH, you're more likely to see herbicide carryover. Or if you do an application and you have low precipitation following that residual application. So what happened in this past growing season is that we had corn and soybean herbicides that were sprayed late in 2019, and they were followed by a dry spell and resulted in carryover in 2020. Some of the herbicides that can carry over include herbicides such as atrazine and the HPPD herbicides such as Callisto, Laudis, and Balance. Some of the soybean herbicides that can carry over to corn include the ALS herbicides such as Classic, Pursue, and First Rate, or also PPO herbicides such as Flexer. So if you want to spray a PPO herbicide on soybeans to get rid of those late emerging weeds, I would recommend you replace Flexer with Cobra, because Cobra does not have a rotational interval for corn. So you won't have to deal with carryover issues by replacing Cobra instead of Flexer. And you always got to look at the label to see what those rotational intervals are. For atrazine, it's about 10 months. And the label actually recommends that if you do an atrazine application after June 10th, you should rotate back to corn or sorghum the next growing season. That's what the label says. Sometimes it doesn't happen, but there's always a risk when you don't follow the label. If you want to know more about the factors that influence herbicide carryover and how to mitigate it, there's a couple of articles that you can find online, which will go into more detail about that issue. Another issue that we had is regarding cover crop termination. Cover crop termination can be a problem, especially if you have cold weather conditions. So you always want to keep in mind the temperatures when you do a burnout application. Also watch out for herbicide antagonism. Some herbicides such as atrazine and 2,4-D can antagonize glyphosate on grasses like cereal rye. And also the cover crop species and size. Make sure the cover crop that you're planting doesn't have any contamination with any herbicide resistant weeds or any contamination of herbicide resistant canola, for example. And also, what's the crop tolerance to post herbicides? Let's say you're growing non-GMO corn, your options for terminating cereal rye after planting are very limited. So always keep in mind what's your crop tolerance before making decisions about cover crop termination. And one of the issues that was common in the past growing season, and actually for the past 3 or 4 years, is the antagonism of atrazine products with glyphosate. Here we spray Roundup with Acuron on the left, and on the right you only spray Roundup by itself. And as you can see on the right, where we only had glyphosate, all those plants are dead. On the left, they're still alive. Eventually, these cereal rye plants died, but it took much longer than in the right. So keep in mind that some herbicides can antagonize activity of glyphosate on the grasses, especially atrazine herbicides or also 2,4-D. And another issue is with terminating after planting. We've seen some early season competition of cereal rye with corn. So if you're terminating after planting and you have dry weather conditions after planting, you may actually run into a situation where the cover crop and the corn are gonna compete for moisture, and you can actually capture yield reductions with that as well. And I believe this is my last topic for today. We've seen some issues of Waterhemp resistance to Dicamba. Every year we get a few reports from farmers that spray a Dicamba product and they were not able to control those Waterhemp populations. Some of the main causes are either poor application technologies or the farmer was not spraying at the right rate, or he's spraying weeds that are a little too big. But some of those populations were actually sprayed with the right rate of the herbicide at the right size, and still a full rate of dicamba was not able to control those plants. So for those populations, we collected seeds at the end of the growing season, and we conducted a screening at our greenhouses. And this is kind of what the plants look like after a failed dicamba application. You can see that the meristem is injured. You can see that the meristem is injured, but you have new growth coming out of the sides of the plant. And this is our screen. We have a susceptible population in this left row right here, and then each one of those other rows are suspected resistant populations. And as you can see, with our susceptible population, we're able to kill all those Waterhemp plants with only a quarter pound of dicamba, but we at least had about 60 to 80% survival rate with those suspected resistant populations. And if we use half a pound of dicamba, we control again all the susceptible population, but we have a few surviving plants in those suspected resistant populations. And this is the label rate of dicamba products for Xtend soybeans. If we actually spray a pound of dicamba, we're able to control all those plants. But again, what we can see here is that we're starting to develop a low-level resistance of Waterhemp to dicamba herbicides. And if we do not use residual herbicides, we do not use an integrated weed management approach, we're slowly going to develop resistance to dicamba as well. And we might actually lose that option for management in Xtend soybeans. So you got to watch out for that. Make sure we spray those plants when they're small. Make sure we use residuals, and make sure we get rid of any surviving plants at the end of the growing season. And that's kind of all I had for today. Again, there's a lot of resources for you guys to reach out. But if you have any questions right now, I'll be happy to take them as well.